Today we will be solving inequalities with negatives. So this is no different from how you solve regular inequalities. The only difference is that when you have a negative, you have to remember the simple trick that whenever you divide or multiply by a negative, then you have to flip the sign. So for instance, if I had negative 3x is less than 9, and I wanted to solve for x, I'd have to divide both sides by a negative 3. Now, because I'm dividing by a negative, I have to flip this sign. So instead of it being a less than sign, it's going to be a greater than sign. My negative 3's cross each other out, so I'm left with x is greater than 9 divided by negative 3 would be negative 3. And so when I graph that, I'd have my point at negative 3. It'd be an open circle because it's only a greater than sign. Because my variable's on the left, I can use my arrow trick, and seeing that my arrow is pointed towards the right, I'm going to shade towards the right. For a, we've got 18 is less than 3x. So this is no different from how we've had them in the past. So we have to divide both by 3. 18 divided by 3 is 6. Now, what tends to mess people up is as soon as you explain the trick about the negatives, people want to flip the sign every single time they divide. But you only flip the sign if you're dividing by a negative. So in this case, we're dividing by a positive. So I am not going to change this sign. So it's going to stay 6 is less than 3 divided by 3. Cross each other out. So you're just left with x. So you got 6 is less than x. When you graph that, it's going to be an open circle because it's just a less than sign. My variable is presently on the right, so I've got to flip this around so I can use my trick. So I'm going to have x is greater than 6. So right now my variable's on the left, so my arrow trick says that I can shade to the right. Alright, so for b, we have negative 8x is less than 144. Alright, so we want to divide both sides by a negative 8. Alright, so we're dividing by a negative, which means I need to flip my sign. The negative 8's over here, cross each other out. So I've got x is greater than 144 divided by negative 8. Should be negative 18. So when we graph that, we'll have an open circle at negative 18 because it's just a greater than sign, and because my variable's on the left, I can use my shading trick, and my arrow's pointing towards the right, so I'm going to shade towards the right. Alright, for c, we've got 3x is greater than or equal to negative 75. Okay, so once again, I want to get rid of the 3, so I'm going to divide both sides by 3. And because I'm only dividing by a positive and not a negative, I'm not going to flip my sign. So negative 75 divided by 3 would be negative 25. If I graph that, I'm going to have a closed circle at negative 25 because it's greater than or equal to. And then using my arrow trick, seeing that my variable's on the left, I'm going to shade towards the right. So d, we got x over 3 is less than 12. Alright, so remember, when you have x over something, remember that this middle line in a fraction means division. So in order to get rid of division, you have to multiply. So I need to multiply both sides by 3 to get rid of this x over 3. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. And if I do that, these 3's cross each other out. So I'm left with x. And I multiplied by a positive, so I'm not going to flip the sign. So the sign stays the same, and 12 times 3 would be 36. So when I graph it, I'm going to have an open circle at 36 because it's just a less than sign. And because my variable's on the left, I can use my arrow trick, and my arrow's pointing towards the left, so I'm going to shade towards the left. For e, we have negative 8 is less than negative x over 5. All right, so now I want to get rid of this negative 5. So in order to get rid of this negative 5, I've got to multiply both sides by negative 5. So if I multiply by a negative 5, multiply by a negative 5, all right, I'm multiplying by a negative, so I've got to flip the sign. So I'm going to have a less than sign turn to a greater than sign. Negative 8 times negative 5 would be positive 40. And the negative 5's here cross each other out, so you're just left with x. All right, so when I graph this, I'm going to have an open circle at 40. And presently I can't use the arrow trick because my variable's on the right. So I've got to flip this around. So I'm going to have x is less than 40. So now that my variable's on the left, my arrow trick says to shade to the left. So I'm going to shade to the left. F. We've got negative x over 3 is greater than or equal to 17. All right, so once again, I want to get rid of that negative 3. So I'm going to multiply both sides by a negative 3. So my negative 3's cross each other out. On this side I'm left with x, but because I multiplied by a negative, I've got to flip the sign. So now it's less than or equal to, and 17 times negative 3 would be negative 51. All right, so when I graph this, I'm going to have a closed circle at negative 51 because it's a less than or equal to sign. And seeing that my variable's on the left, I can use my shading trick. My arrow is pointing towards the left, so I'm going to shade towards the left. So for g, we've got 3/4 x is greater than or equal to negative 12. In order to get rid of a fraction, you have to remember that you have to multiply by the reciprocal. So in order to get rid of 3/4, I'd have to multiply by 4 over 3. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 4 over 3. All right, so the 3/4 and the 4/3 cross each other out. I multiplied by a positive, so I don't have to flip the sign. And then if I do negative 12 times 4/3, if I do negative 12 times 4, I get negative 48 over 3. And then negative 48 divided by 3 would be negative 16. All right, so when I graph this, I'm going to have a closed circle at negative 16. And seeing that my variable's on the left, I can use my shading trick, and the arrow's pointing towards the right, so I'm going to shade towards the right. For h, I've got negative 2/3 x is less than 18. All right, so once again, I've got to get rid of that fraction. So in order to get rid of that fraction, I have to multiply by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of negative 2 over 3 would be negative 3 over 2. So I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 3 over 2. So my negative 3/2 and my negative 2/3 cross each other out. And because I multiply by a negative, I've got to flip my sign. So negative 3 times 18 would be negative 54 over 2. And negative 54 divided by 2 would be negative 27. So I've got x is greater than negative 27. So when I graph that, because it's a greater than sign, it's going to be an open circle. And because my variable's on the left, I can use my shading trick. So my arrow is pointing towards the right. So I'm going to shade towards the right. So for I, we've got negative 20 is greater than or equal to 4/5 x. All right, so once again, in order to get rid of a fraction, you have to multiply by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 4/5 would be 5/4. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 5/4. All right, so I didn't multiply by a negative, so my sign's going to stay the same. My 4/5 and my 5/4 cross each other out. So I'm left with x on that side, 5 times negative 20 would be negative 100 over 4. And negative 100 divided by 4 would be negative 25, is greater than or equal to x. So, when I graph this, I'm going to have a closed circle at negative 25. And right now I can't use my arrow trick, so I've got to shift things around. So x is less than or equal to negative 25. And so now my arrow trick says to shade to the left, so I'm going to shade towards the left. So the key thing to remember in all of this is that whenever you divide or multiply by a negative, that you have to flip the sign.